In 2017, Hurricane Irma left a string of small Caribbean islands devastated, including this small two-island nation, Antigua and Barbuda. The storm damaged or destroyed nearly 95% of Barbuda's infrastructure.
I know that we can't control sea level rise and we can't control a lot of what's already been set in motion. Thinking about how severe 2017 was as a hurricane, where thousands of people were displaced, we were not prepared for that.
Antigua and Barbuda finds itself at the front line of the climate crisis without really having contributed to it. The world's leading climate scientists just released their latest assessment showing that this is not an outlier. This is the climate crisis. It is felt everywhere, but not equally. And it raises questions about how we deal with climate impacts, especially for those most affected.
The IPCC report
is a necklace of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership.
You may have come across this graph. It shows the global temperature variations over the last 2021 years. Over the last century, global temperatures have risen significantly, and now we are deep in the red. And according to the world's biggest report on climate change, it is unequivocally our fault. Last year, the first part of the new IPCC report found that greenhouse gases from human activities had caused approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming. That is that scary red spike at the end. And now the IPCC is back with part 2 of its 6th report, this time focusing on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerabilities.
I've seen many scientific reports in my time, but nothing like this.
Across 4,000 bleak pages, the new report shows that climate risks are appearing faster and will get more severe sooner than we thought. Limits are already being reached, some irreversibly, and every increment of further warming is making the situation worse, pushing more people and species to their limits and beyond. And probably most damning, we are not prepared, even for the current impacts. For example, extreme weather events that are brought on or exacerbated by climate change have caused widespread and severe damage already.
Oh my God.
From the massive wildfires tearing through the west coast of the United States, to the floods and landslides in India and Nepal, the prolonged extreme drought in Kenya, as well as the severe flooding that Western Europe experienced.
The climate crisis is already wreaking havoc in our daily own lives. In Kenya, just last year, the president of the country announced drought as a national emergency. It put millions of Kenyans at risk of severe and unforgiving hunger.
Over the last decades, the mortality from floods, drought, and storms has been up to 15 times higher in the most affected countries, including most of Africa and large parts of Central America. It's clear now more than ever, the world needs climate action and needs it fast. Mitigation, which means our global efforts to curb emissions like switching to renewable energy in order to avoid our atmosphere from heating up any further, is absolutely vital, but no longer enough. Because even though these efforts would substantially reduce projected losses and damages, they cannot eliminate them. And besides, these efforts will take decades to affect rising temperatures.
We're quite clear that really the next 10 years is critical for adaptation. Decisions that we make today are going to have long-term consequences. So we absolutely have to plan for the long-term risks of climate change, and we have to start doing that now. And related to that, I think we really underscore the importance of keeping temperatures to 1.5, where if we go beyond that, then it's going to just become increasingly difficult and for some places impossible to adapt.
But what does climate adaptation actually look like? Well, imagine you're on a boat that has a hole and is slowly sinking. Fun, I know. Mitigation would mean fixing the underlying issue by patching up the hole, for example. But the boat is already filling up with water, so you need to start removing as much of it as you can to stay afloat. You need to adapt. Adaptation also means preparing a life jacket on board. There are preemptive measures and reactive measures you can take. Neither fix the actual issue, but they minimize the risk of you drowning. And if we're sticking with the boat analogy, by the way, some countries are the equivalent to yachts. Some are rubber dinghies. Caught in a storm, those are very different baselines. Risks and vulnerabilities are vastly different across different countries. There are also increasingly limits to adaptation when impacts exceed our ability to curb the risk.
We differentiate between soft and hard limits. Soft limits are where there's still additional adaptation that's possible, but you simply can't do them now. And that's because of a number of constraints. So constraints are things that make it harder to plan and implement adaptation.
In simple terms, if, for example, a country doesn't have the financial resources or the governance, it can't adapt.
I think it was 1.5 years ago, this huge hurricane destroyed completely the islands of San Andres and Providencia, and everything got destroyed. And even though there was like a big fund for this to reconstruct the houses for the communities, right now it's still being rebuilt, but they haven't rebuilt any education or medical centers, just like a tourism complex. Even though when a fund is designated for something, there's corruption, there's a lot of interest in like interposing in these processes.
And then there are hard limits, meaning adapting to climate impacts is no longer possible. For example, rising sea levels impacting small islands and coastal communities, or desertification affecting parts of Africa or the Middle East. Some places in the world will simply no longer be inhabitable and people will be forced to migrate.
We do have agency, right? We can put additional finance, we can come up with additional technology, but if we don't, you're going to reach a limit. It could be soft, it could be hard, but we really wanted to stress that adaptation can not be enough to prevent some of these negative impacts from happening.
So the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when adaptation meets its limits one way or another? When it's too little, too late, and the boat is actually sinking? This brings up a massively important concept: loss and damage. It's telling that there's not an official definition for loss and damage, but the idea is simple. Loss refers to things that are irrecoverable. For example, loss of human lives, biodiversity, or territory. Damage refers to things that can be repaired or restored. For example, damaged infrastructure, livelihoods, homes.
So in some ways, the concept of loss and damage isn't that complicated. The UN has made it quite complicated because of the politics around the idea of loss and damage. Actually, the idea of loss and damage, even though it might not have been called that at the time, was introduced at the very beginning in the kind of early 1990s when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was first established. And small island and developing states, I think, brought up this notion that there are going to be these impacts of climate change that might affect them in an existential way, and that there might be some responsibility to be taken by countries that have emitted more than others.
But so far, those who have emitted the most have been able to avoid this responsibility, and we're only slowly making progress on loss and damage funding.
So for example, Barbuda is really still just building back after Irma in 2017. We're doing work in the Bahamas, and the kind of two islands that were hit by Hurricane Dorian in 2019, a year later, a lot of those places still didn't have electricity. They still didn't have running water.
There was a request for monetary compensation for the loss and damage that occurred during Irma, but that funding was never actually granted, right?
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. I get sort of frustrated when I think about, because that money wasn't there for us, the government still has to figure out how are we going to get the funding for these things. And I know families who are still, who don't have their homes and still live in tents.
If you're wondering why this money wasn't delivered, let me tell you. Antigua and Barbuda were ruled to be too rich to qualify for most aid grants needed to rebuild post-Irma.
We're experiencing conditions that still make it very clear that we are second class and that we are somewhat disposable. I'm talking about communities who are on the front lines and have been absolutely forgotten after Hurricane Irma. And I can only imagine what it's like for other countries as well.
While there are several possible responses to loss and damage, including long-term funding or disaster relief, the one favored by rich countries is insurance. Don't fall asleep on me here. It's actually really interesting, and there are some serious issues.
So the way that insurance works in a very simple way is, I pay a premium, and if a storm hits, that has, for example, kind of wind speeds of a certain amount or a certain amount of damage is done, then I get a payout. Usually that payout isn't going to cover all of my costs, and it's really contingent on me being able to pay that premium.
And of course, many of the areas most affected are not able to cover the cost of the premiums.
The other problem with insurance is that it's not necessarily appropriate for slow onset events, right? If we know that certain islands are going to disappear in the next couple of decades, what insurance company wants to take that on?
Slow onset events like sea level rise aren't considered risks when we talk about insurance. They're considered certainties. Insurance companies won't go near that.
It doesn't address the justice problem that underpins the issue of loss and damage, which is, the polluter pays principle, right? The idea that those responsible for causing this damage should bear the costs of that. Instead, it puts the cost of, even if it's just the cost of paying those premiums onto those people that are, have contributed least to causing this problem.
And in news that will surprise absolutely no one, vulnerable countries pushed for more equity and justice at COP26 in Glasgow. But the establishment of a dedicated fund failed yet again after resistance from rich nations.
Some global north countries like the United States are committed to not setting up a loss and damage facility. And this just shows of how, again, committed they are to not taking up responsibility for a crisis they caused.
The new report provides further evidence for the need of a financial mechanism that will carry the cost for the most affected countries.
We really tried to stress the urgency of action, not just on mitigation, but also on adaptation and also on dealing with these losses and damages that are being experienced now.
Any arguments for climate action are typically followed by the question, who's going to pay for that? Well, with this new IPCC report, it is safe to say that doing too little and suffering the consequences will cost us much more than if we invest in a livable future now. If we continue to ignore the warnings from scientists, mitigation will be harder, the limitations for adaptation will multiply, and the cost of loss and damage will increase exponentially. The window of opportunity for us to prevent the worst and make us more climate resilient is closing with every 0.1 degree of warming. But it's not too late to do something about this.
I don't have a statement to say to anyone anymore or to the rest of the world. It's a question, and it would be, what else do you need? You're met with the experiences of climate activists who are on the front lines begging for justice, and scientists who are there to back you up with scientific information, and historians and artists and so many people who are working collectively to try and frame this in the most clear way possible. My only question would be, what else would we need, and what's not being communicated for action to truly be taken seriously by countries in the global north?